Or the horticulture industry is looking after its workers as it increases the RSE cap. 3,000 additional workers will be allowed into New Zealand under the recognised seasonal employer scheme in an effort to ease workforce pressures. But the Green Party says the cap shouldn't be increased until a review into the scheme has been done and has called for the review to be brought forward. The Prime Minister insists the government has already taken steps to crack down on migrant exploitation.
I reject the idea at all that we take lightly those issues. Our job is to ensure, as it always has been when this scheme was established, to make sure that it benefits the worker and not just the employer.
The government will require employers to give workers sick leave. A local construction supplier says the price of steel jumped 10% over the weekend, following a sharp fall in the New Zealand dollar. The Kiwi has fallen 3.5% over the past 3 days and is down 17% for the year. It's been caught in the crossfire of high inflation, rising interest rates and global economic woes, which has seen investors flock to the safety of the US dollar. Tiger Steel Managing Director Brent Curnow says the weaker dollar will hit the construction industry head-on.
Price went up over the weekend of steel by 10%. This relates to the exchange rate for the US dollars because all product that's imported for steel is purchased in US currency, and everyone along the construction chain will have to pass these costs on as well.
Brent Curnow says it's difficult to predict when the Kiwi will strengthen. An online voting guide aimed at the Chinese New Zealand community has breached electoral laws. The guide included imitation images of voting papers that had Auckland mayoral candidate Wayne Brown as the only named candidate and a tick next to his name. Lucia has more.
Auckland Electoral Officer Dale Ofsoski says it's illegal to publish any imitation of a voting paper. He has ordered Mr Brown to remove the post, which was published under the account Wayne Brown Elections. Mr Brown says the post was made by a supporter and that he wasn't aware of it previously. He has since arranged for the post to be removed and says he regrets any accidental breach. Mayoral candidate Efeso Collins says he's disappointed with a post like this, as the migrant community deserves straightforward information about local elections.
A 4-week-old baby suffered a methadone overdose after a pharmacy failed to dispense their medication correctly back in 2018. A pharmacy technician accidentally mixed prescribed colic medicine with methadone, which went unnoticed by a pharmacist. Finn Blackwell has more.
The baby had to be treated successfully in ICU. The Deputy Health and Disability Commissioner found the pharmacist failed to carry out the appropriate checks in the dispensing process, leading to the error. She says the pharmacist had the responsibility of ensuring the accurate dispensing of medicine and should have double-checked. The Deputy Commissioner said it could have been far worse if the baby's mother hadn't intervened when she did. The pharmacist has since expressed regret, and the pharmacy has implemented changes.
And a goat farmer in suburban Wellington has lost 60 baby goats this year alone, killed and eaten by wild pigs. Naomi Steenkamp's farm is tucked behind the Brooklyn wind turbine, only 12 minutes' drive from the city centre. She says they've shot 6 wild pigs since July and are keeping their goats inside overnight.
We're talking poor defenceless animals within minutes of birth just being eaten alive, and all I find when we go out there is just some fur and, fragments of bone. It's heart-wrenching.
Naomi Steenkamp says this year, for the first time, young boars are coming out in the evenings and breaking through predator-proof fencing to get to the goats. In sport, last year's US Open runner-up, Canadian Leila Fernandez, will compete at Auckland's ASB Tennis Classic in January. The Auckland tournament is back after a 3-year hiatus due to COVID. The 20-year-old Fernandez reached the quarterfinals of this year's French Open. Other players already confirmed for tournament include Coco Gauff, Cam Norrie and Casper Ruud. Heavyweight boxer Joseph Parker is now eyeing a fight against a British boxer Dillian White as he looks to put his weekend loss behind him. Parker was knocked out by Joe Joyce in the 11th round of their fight in Manchester on Sunday. The win earns Joyce the WBO interim heavyweight title, as well as putting him in pole position to challenge world champion Alexander Usyk. Parker suffered a unanimous points loss to White 4 years ago and told the ID Boxing podcast White would be an ideal opponent.
If he's free and available and there's nothing locked in for him, I think it'll be a great fight. He's coming off a loss against Tyson, I'm coming off a loss against Joyce. And I think if we can make it happen, it'll be great because the first fight was a close fight and a tough fight, and we can make it a more exciting fight the second time around.
And England will head to November's Football World Cup on the back of a 6-match winless sequence after a 3-3 draw at home to Germany in the Nations League. England finished bottom of their group. Italy beat Hungary 2-0 to top the group and reach the semi-finals. That's the news.
The Kiwi dollar slides.
Well, it's certainly, if imported goods go up, then yes, you're correct. That will certainly put pressure on inflation.
A new far-right government rises.
The great objective that we've always had is that of ensuring Italians may once again be proud to be Italians.
And a rocket crashes into an asteroid.
It will smash into the asteroid to just give it a little nudge in order to slightly change its orbit.
Here, there and everywhere. Morning Report, weekdays from 6 on RNZ National.
This is RNZ National on air on rnz.co.nz and on your mobile. You're with Nick Trubridge next on Checkpoint. Right now, the short forecast from Met Service to midnight Wednesday. For Northland, Auckland, Coromandel Peninsula, Bay of Plenty and Gisborne, often cloudy. Isolated showers clearing Gisborne tomorrow afternoon. From Waikato to Taranaki, including Taumaru Nui and Taupo. Partly cloudy, isolated showers developing about Taupo this evening and elsewhere tomorrow. From Whanganui to Wellington, including Taihape, Hawke's Bay and Wairarapa. Fine today, partly cloudy tomorrow. Nelson and Marlborough, fine with high cloud. A few showers developing tonight, mainly about the ranges, then turning to rain tomorrow evening. For Bulla, Westland and Fiordland, a few showers turning to rain tomorrow morning with heavy falls. For Canterbury, fine today, scattered rain developing about the high country tomorrow morning with a few spots elsewhere, then clearing in the evening. Otago and Southland, partly cloudy with scattered showers clearing tonight. Scattered rain developing about central Otago tomorrow with a few spots elsewhere. And for Rekohu, the Chatham Islands, cloudy periods, a few showers tomorrow. The time is 7 minutes past 5. Our next headlines and traffic are at about 5:20.
Thanks, Evie. Good evening. Welcome to Checkpoint. I'm Nick Trubridge. Get ready to pay even more for goods and services that come in from overseas. The Kiwis on the slide, down 2% in the last week and 17% for the year to date. It's been caught in the crossfire of high inflation, rising interest rates and global economic woes. A local construction supplier says the price of steel jumped 10% over the weekend, which will hit the construction industry head on. And the implications for New Zealand, well, they don't end there. Here's our business reporter, Nicholas Poynton.
The power of the dollar in your pocket is weakening. The Kiwi's fallen close to 3 cents against the US dollar in the past week to levels last seen during the first 2020 lockdown. The managing director of the local steel importer, Tiger Steel, Brent Curnow, says the decline has been significant.
Effectively, the price went up over the weekend of steel by 10%. This relates to the exchange rate for the US dollars because all product that's imported for steel is purchased in US currency. It's had a dramatic effect.
He says the weaker dollar will see consumers paying higher prices for imported products, which may curb demand in parts of the construction sector.
We've noticed that residential-related steel companies have had decreasing demand, but commercial construction seems to be able to absorb a lot more than residential.
The recent sell-off in the New Zealand dollar against the greenback is not isolated. Currencies around the world have been hammered this year by the aggressive tightening of monetary policy by the world's most important central bank, the US Federal Reserve, which has lifted the value of the US dollar to a 20-year high. The recently announced British mini-budget, which promises to increase borrowing but cut taxes, has also spooked financial markets, with investors flocking to the safety of US assets. Harbour Asset Management currency strategist Hamish Pepper says against this backdrop, the slide in the Kiwi is not unusual.
I think this is a reaction which we are somewhat used to, where if there are worries in the world, if equity markets are falling, for example, if people are worried, we are a currency that tends to reflect some of that concern.
He says while a weaker currency is a boon for exporters, it's the opposite of what the Reserve Bank wants.
It wants to see the inflation that we're inheriting from the rest of the world to becoming lower, and it's wanting to see domestic economic activity slowing. And so a weaker currency works against both of those things and argues for our central bank to have to do a bit more in its inflation fight.
Reserve Bank Governor Adrian Orr says New Zealand is caught in a global trend but is faring better than most. He says the end is in sight for interest rate hikes.
So we've got, a little bit more to do before we can drop to our normal happy place, which is to watch, worry and wait and look for signs of inflation up or down. At the moment we still feel we're too close to some sense of neutral, but well on course to achieve that.
The Reserve Bank is expected to deliver on that promise next week, where it's widely forecast to lift interest rates by another 50 basis points, taking the official cash rate to 3.5%.
And joining us now to put all of this into perspective is Cameron Baggery, the Managing Director of Baggery Economics. Kia ora, Cameron, how are you?
Kia ora.
Look, let's start with the big implications for the Kiwi dollar here. What are they exactly?
Well, currencies are two-sided coins, and what's going on at the moment is that the US dollar is moving up around the globe as we start to see risk aversion take hold, and the United States is lifting interest rates reasonably aggressive. So the US dollar goes up, New Zealand dollar goes down, and it's not just the New Zealand dollar, it's the Australian dollar, the pound, the euro, Japanese yen, you name it. Everybody's suffering on the other side as we see a mad rush into US-denominated assets.
So who gets hurt most here? We heard from some business owners or some importers in that story. Run us through them.
Well, you've got two sides of the coin. On the hurt or painful side of the ledgers, you obviously got importers. You've got the consumer, because as the dollar goes down, of course, it forces up imported prices. So that adds to general inflation and it adds to the cost of living costs for some of those imported items. Offshore travel is going to get progressively more expensive if you're looking at a US-denominated destination. The flip side is that, look, currencies are a relative price variable. They're just what's called screw the scrum. And at the moment, we're screwing the scrum away from importing goods, away from domestic consumption of those imported items towards the export sector. So there's an awful lot of farmers out there across New Zealand at the moment that got pretty big grins on their face, because as the New Zealand dollar goes up, of course, the price they receive for those produce that they put on the global stage move north. The other sector that's going to be smiling, of course, is the tourism market. Cost of New Zealand holidays gets cheaper to a foreigner as the New Zealand dollar goes south.
Yeah, and when it comes to the New Zealand dollar as it pertains to the US, how far could things fall here, do you think?
Well, that's the million-dollar question. If you look at the currency at the moment, within a purchasing power parity or some sort of notion of fair value, we're on the south side of the ledger. Because we're on the south side of that fair value ledger, does not necessarily mean that we're going to sort of bounce up to fair value. But we're getting into that zone where the rubber band looks like it's getting pretty stretched on the south side of the ledger. So you'd imagine that, we're into that zone where further moves south are going to get incrementally more difficult to achieve. The caveat, look, currencies are pretty wild beasts and they tend to take on a bit of a mind of their own, and at the moment there is a mad rush towards the US dollar. And if that continues to hold, then further south side moves could open up for the New Zealand dollar. We've been as low as 40 cents against the greenback in about 2000, 2001 when we had that sort of dot-com bubble. Do I think we're going anywhere near that? The answer is no. But we're certainly seeing a lot of pressure for the Kiwi dollar to move south, although I think it's recovered today. The other thing which is not getting talked about is that, look, the New Zealand dollar is also down against the Australian dollar. And that's a little bit more of a relative fundamental story, where if you look at New Zealand's economic fundamentals are starting to slowly deteriorate. We saw a big blowout in the current account which is our national check, but with the rest of the globe a couple of weeks ago, we're $28 billion in the red. That's a pretty eye-watering number. So New Zealand doesn't just need a cheaper currency against the greenback. We need a cheaper currency all round. We've seen the New Zealand dollar, Aussie dollar, come down from the mid-90s to around 88 cents at present.
Yeah, and you touched on it briefly before, but let's say you or I are lucky enough to go to the US or the Kiwi or the UK for a holiday. How's it looking for us?
Well, it's looking pretty expensive to go to the United States relative to what it was 12 months ago. It's not too bad to go to the United Kingdom because, of course, what we're seeing at the moment is that the pound's come under a fair bit of pressure over the past 48 hours, particularly as markets have dished out a pretty swift response to what can only be described as a splash the cash style mini budget that the incoming government has announced there. Markets took a look at the idea of more spending and more tax cuts, and the pound went south at a pretty fast clip. So ironically, we're going to be more expensive to go holiday in the United States, but there's still some destinations out there at the moment in regard to the holiday plans. There's still a lot there offer relative value, at least through a currency lens.
Thanks, Cameron. Cameron Bagri joining us there from Bagri Economics. It is 5:15. You're listening to Checkpoint on RNZ National. Coming up, how was your long weekend? 3 days off. It was glorious, wasn't it? I went to football, I watched rugby, watched a couple of films. And now that means we've got a 4-day week, of course, doesn't it? So what do you think? Should we stick with a 4-day week? Would you be more productive over 4 than 5? I probably would be. Would you be more productive over 4 versus 5?
I already am.
Yeah. Same. Yeah. Well, I mean, me and Evie are for it.
Yeah.
Tell us what you think of it. You can text us, of course, 2101. We've got an interview coming up about that in a little while as well. You can also email us, checkpoint@rnz.co.nz. Right, the government's letting in another 3,000 RSE workers to bring relief to the horticulture sector. It's a 19% increase on the previous season and means there's now access to 19,000 workers a year from Pacific countries. That's an increase of 3,000 workers. The Immigration Minister, of course, that's Michael Wood, says the increase acknowledges the industry's need for workers. Just last month, the Minister announced a full review into the RSE scheme after the Equal Employment Opportunities Commissioner witnessed conditions she described as modern-day slavery. Michael Wood says today's deal gives the workers more entitlements.
Sure. So we have things like sick leave and bereavement leave have been two of the areas that have been covered. Similarly, annual leave. Those areas are not currently part of the provisions that RSE workers have. That's why we've said that we want to have a full review of the scheme in early 2023. But as a government, we don't want to wait till then. We want to start the process of having workers, unions, employers at the table to look at how we can improve things in all of these areas.
So what concessions have you got to date? Obviously, we've spoken about sick leave, but what other things have you got coming down the pipeline?
Sure. So specifically the sick leave, which I've identified, and we'll work on the details of that over the next few weeks. We've also said that we'll have further work over the next few months on bereavement leave, travel costs and deductions from the wages of RSE workers. And these are some of the main issues that have been raised publicly recently. We're also going to, in two of the areas, trial what's called a worker roving rep scheme, which is where workers themselves will be given the ability and the tools to be able to go around work sites, to be able to talk with their fellow workers and directly raise concerns if they're coming through from the workforce. So that's a way of giving this workforce a real voice that perhaps in the past hasn't been there. And in the short term, we're also conducting an urgent review of the accommodation standards in this area to ensure that those standards are fit and proper. And what we would expect.
Sorry to interrupt, Minister. These aren't new issues, though, are they? I mean, I'm looking at an article right in front of me, actually, from 2017. Some Fijian RSE workers complaining about, everything really from accommodation to pay to transport costs. So why do this now?
Oh, well, look, I came into this role in July of this year, and the decision
sorry to interrupt, Minister. I realise you've only just come into it, but your government's been in power since, Labour, I should say, has been in power in one way or another since 2017. So why now?
Well, that's right, and we have made ongoing improvements over that period, including improving the minimum wages paid to workers in this sector, including strengthening the Labour Inspectorate, including weeding out some of the worst employers from it and not enabling them to employ REC workers. So we have got ongoing work, but I'm really clear that we need to do more. This needs to be a scheme which works for the employers, works for the workers, works for everyone concerned.
Let's talk about accommodation, because of course there's been a lot of coverage about that lately. You only have to look at Stuff, you look at RNZ recently. Conditions and accommodation, what can you actually do to make sure those are up to scratch, so to speak?
Well, the way that the accommodation standards and actually many of the conditions around the RS scheme are set are through what are called immigration instructions, and those effectively are rules that the Minister of Immigration signs off. And so one of the things that I have asked officials to do is to look at the rules and the instructions that we currently have around accommodation to ensure that they are fit for purpose and up to the standard that we would expect. And I think that based on what we've seen, there is likely to be significant room for improvement in that area. So officials are currently working on that at the moment. They'll be coming back to me with further advice, I would say, in the coming couple of months in that area.
Yeah.
And if we need to improve those standards, then I will act on it.
And all good and well to address rules and regulations, of course, but I'm talking about follow-through. How are you going to actually make sure that we do not see the types of conditions that people end up working in despite the rules? I mean, it was only a couple of months ago on this show we had the Equal Employment Opportunities Commissioner saying she had seen conditions that were inhumane and in some cases, well, could reach the threshold of a criminal investigation.
Well, that's why we've worked very closely with stakeholders. We've actually brought unions and workers into this discussion, so there's a worker voice as we work this stuff through. I've met with Commissioner Sumeo to directly hear her concerns, and I want, as long as she's willing to be, her to be involved in this discussion as well. We need to get the standards right, but then we absolutely will ensure that there is a follow-through and enforcement from our Labour Inspectorate. They have actually been very active in this area, but one of the things that they confirm is that we need to make sure that we've got the standards right, so that they are able to enforce against them. That's why getting that work underway as soon as possible is so important.
What's your view on a fair proportion of salary to put towards accommodation, for example?
Oh, look, that is something that I would have to receive further advice on, and I wouldn't make a number up on the spot in an interview. But we need to make sure that accommodation costs are fair and proportionate, and that there is not, let's be blunt here, rorting going on of workers who don't particularly have any choice about where they stay. So we'll be looking very closely at those issues alongside the quality of the accommodation.
Are you worried there are workers out there that are being left with, well, almost nothing in their pay packet by the time they pay for accommodation and other costs?
Well, the purpose of the scheme has to be what we call win-win-win. Win for the countries involved, win for the employers who get access to the seasonal labour they need, and it has to be a win for the workers and their community. So if we have situations where systemically workers are not having a decent income left after those deductions and accommodation, that would not be meeting the outcomes that we want. That's why in that next phase of work, all of those questions around accommodation and deductions are a part of what we will be looking at.
You mentioned, of course, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commissioner's, some of her comments. What do you say to the family members of individuals who are on the receiving end of these conditions?
Well, look, I'm someone who's a Labour Party minister who spent about 20 years of my life working in and around the union movement and believes that every single worker in our country should be treated with dignity and respect, should be paid fairly and should be treated fairly. That's why we've made the improvements that we have to date, and that's why I've prioritised this work over the next few months to ensure that when we're not meeting those standards within the scheme, that we make the improvements to ensure that we do. We want this to be a scheme that everyone can be proud of. If the accommodation is poor, if the returns to workers are not fair, then we're not meeting those objectives. And increasingly when I talk to employers in the sector, they recognise that we need to make those improvements for this to be a sustainable scheme.
Immigration Minister Michael Wood there. It is 23 minutes past 5. You're with Checkpoint on RNZ National. Kia ora e te iwi, I'm Nick Trubridge and this is Checkpoint. Keen for your feedback this evening. Of course, we were just talking about 4-day weeks, which, we in the studio were keen on. Let us know whether you are as well. That would be a 3-day weekend, of course. Sounds pretty good. And also the Kiwi dollar, of course. Do you have plans for an overseas holiday, specifically to the US? And are you, a little bit worried about how it's going to go, given, you may not get as much bang for your buck, mightn't you? You can text us 2101. You can tweet us at Checkpoint RNZ. You can Facebook us Checkpoint, or you can email us checkpoint@rnz.co.nz. But first, here's the headlines, with Evie.
Kia ora, Nick. The police have arrested 6 people over the robbery at a jewellery store in the St Luke's shopping mall in Auckland a week ago. The Operation Rhino investigation team arrested and charged an 18-year-old male and 5 youths overnight with aggravated robbery. The government says the horticulture industry will need to look after its extra workers as it increases the recognised seasonal employer scheme by requiring employers to give workers sick leave. 3,000 additional workers will be allowed into New Zealand in an effort to ease workforce pressures. A local construction supplier has told Checkpoint the price of steel jumped 10% over the weekend, following a sharp fall in the New Zealand dollar. Auckland electoral officer Dale Ofsosky says he's ordered Auckland's leading mayoral candidate, Wayne Brown, to take down an online voting guide aimed at the Chinese New Zealand community, as it's illegal to publish any imitation of a voting paper. Mr Brown says the post was made by a supporter and that he wasn't aware of it previously. Police in Tairawhiti are trying to find a person who may have a weapon at a beach north of Gisborne. A section of the coastal state Highway 35 will be closed near Turihaua Beach, about 20 minutes north of the city. Diversions are in place and motorists should avoid the area if possible. And a goat farmer in suburban Wellington has lost 60 baby goats this year alone, killed and eaten by wild pigs who are breaking through predator-proof fencing. Those are the headlines. Looking at traffic in Auckland, a breakdown northbound in the Waterview Tunnel has been cleared before 5 o'clock, but there's possibly residual delays knowing Auckland traffic. State Highway 1 is closed north of Wellington in Levin, probably for a few hours after a crash between a vehicle and a mobility scooter at the intersection of Queen Street East and Oxford Street. Diversions are in place there. Meanwhile, State Highway 2 in Greytown reopened just before 5 after a crash that's left one person in a serious condition. Another crash did close State Highway 1 north of Kaikoura for a time today after a fatal crash there, but that reopened after 3 p.m, so not a great day on our roads today. Our next headlines and traffic are at 5:40.
Thanks, Evie. That 4-day week interviews coming up, so we'll see how the trial's gone in the UK.
Oh, it's fabulous. I already know. I've been looking at the research, of course, doing my own.
We'll get more in just a second. But first, the All Whites, of course, played in New Zealand for the first time in 5 years on Sunday in front of one of the biggest football crowds in New Zealand history. And yeah, it was brilliant. I was there, my mates were there, and it was the atmosphere was unreal. Better than the All Blacks, maybe? Well, I think there's an argument. Anyway, won't go there. Sorry. But what happens next for the team is still up in the air. New Zealand football are, of course, yet to lock in any upcoming matches, I should say. And coach Danny Hayes' future is also uncertain. That comes, of course, after the All Whites failed to qualify for the World Cup in Qatar. Well, joined in the studio is, Felicity Reid is joining me in the studio. Let's start that again. Danny Hay, I mean, this is where the attention turns to now, right? Of course, there are no more internationals locked in for the next wee while, and we're not going to the World Cup in Qatar. But why haven't we locked him in yet? Because he seems to be pretty popular.
Yes, well, retiring captain Winston Reid and experienced striker Chris Wood were pretty vocal after that game at the weekend that you're at. They came out and said that, this is somebody who they want in that role. Chris Wood went as far as to say New Zealand football would be silly, absolutely silly, not to keep him, and it would be a detriment to New Zealand football to lose him. So this is somebody, Chris Wood, who knows a little bit about managers under pressure. He's in the EPL with with Newcastle United.
Bit of an upgrade there for him.
But he's somebody who is coming out and saying this and backing the coach. But New Zealand football, they're in a little bit of a tricky position at the moment. They're currently doing a review of that failed World Cup qualifying campaign. So until that review has run its course, they're not going to come out and say whether they're keeping Danny Hay for another few years or not.
It almost mirrors another certain coaching dilemma we've had over the last couple of months that's been covered extensively here, right? A coach sort of under fire, but the players backing him. How does his contract, though, compare to, other in New Zealand football's history?
Well, so Danny came into the role in 2019, and as we've said, that contract runs out in the middle of next month. But if we compare that to the football ferns, so the women's side, that's Yitka Kumklova. Last year, she signed a 6-year contract. So that takes her through to and beyond, the World Cup in New Zealand next year. That's, a pretty decent contract. And she's got the football ferns quite a few games over these past year. Like, it has been overseas, but they've got a couple of games in New Zealand coming up. And these are the things that Danny Hay is actually requesting of New Zealand football. He wants something similar. He wants the All Whites to be playing, as we've heard, not any games locked in. So for him to even show any interest in remaining in this role, as much as the players want him to, he actually wants the All Whites, New Zealand football, to have backed this campaign and to have games against good quality opposition locked in.
What's your read on this from a New Zealand football point of view? We were speaking before about they basically may be wary of shooting themselves in the foot, right? They've got this review to do. Maybe once that finishes, we'll have some answers, as opposed to carriage before horse, so to speak.
Oh,
Horse before
absolutely.
carriage, so to speak. Yeah.
Surely you don't want to come out during a review making decisions that perhaps should have already been reflected within the review. You don't want to, like you say, come out too soon and say something that, or maybe they have uncovered something within that review. But that's when they plan, once that review's out, that's when they'll give greater clarity around Danny Hay's future. And like I say, maybe that'll come down to the man himself.
Yeah. Did you watch yesterday?
I did.
Yeah, it was exciting, wasn't it? I mean, 2-0 is never good, but 0-2 is never good. But, they competed all right.
Oh, it was the Socceroos after all.
Yeah,
100
exactly.
years.
They're off to the World Cup. And we're not. Oh, well, maybe next time. Anyway, what a nice bonus long weekend that was. Yeah, it was all right. For those of us who got it, of course. While the long weekend was opposed by many in the business community because of the increased costs they face, it got us thinking, what does it do for productivity in workplaces? There's a trial on in the UK at the moment for a 4-day working week, and it's reached the halfway point. So joining us now is Charlotte Lockhart, who is the founder and CEO of 4-Day Week Global. Kia ora, Charlotte.
Kia ora. How are you?
Very well, thank you. Very well after a 3-day weekend, and feeling even better going into a 4-day week. But you're doing this trial, right? So what's it telling us so far?
Well, we've got our midpoint results that came through. Actually, they came through just a couple of 3 weeks ago, but sadly we had the passing of our monarch, so we couldn't come out with our news at that time. But what the midpoint results are telling us is that over 86, and well over 80% of our people are finding that their productivity has either stayed the same or has increased, and they are looking to continue with reduced hour working of some form, whether it's a 4-day week or some other form of reduced hour working, post the trial. So it's pretty encouraging, really.
Tell us about your trial. Do you cover employees, obviously, but businesses as well? And can we get some of the feedback from business owners?
Yeah, so look, the trials are designed to support businesses to help them find a way to reduce work time, but through focusing in on productivity. And so what the business owners are finding is that there is a much better vibe at work, and so therefore, that everybody seems to enjoy going to work. But they're also finding that this is a great business improvement strategy, that by getting working with their people to find how to improve the business so that their people can have time off, they're actually finding all sorts of ways of improving their business, whether that be through increasing production or increasing a customer experience, or any other levers that you might be able to pull within your business, which we don't necessarily look at until we decide to focus on them.
Are the companies doing this already? You hear about the odd one, right?
Yeah, no, there are thousands of companies around the world doing it already. I mean, we're supporting over 300 companies around the globe doing. Actually, it must be 500 companies now. We've got a trial starting in Europe shortly, South Africa. We've got the UK one. We've already got US and North America. We're onto our second pilot with them. About to start our second pilot with the Irish, and we actually do have one running here in Australasia as well. So we're supporting companies all around the globe. Perpetual Guardian's been doing it since 2018, and there are companies that have been doing it even longer than that. Not many of them, but there are a few out there that they worked out this a little bit earlier. They just didn't talk about it as much as we have.
Do you get much resistance? Because you could probably imagine some business owners will be listening to this and thinking, no, worst idea ever.
Look, the thing is, what we're talking about, this is a business improvement strategy. So if I came into your business and said, look, I can increase your productivity by 20%, you'd probably think I'm selling you a piece of software and you'd probably give me lots of money to do it. But when I say I'm doing this, but I'm going to send you people home, people think I'm mad. But it's just fundamental human psychology that actually when our people are well rested, have less burnout, have the sort of things in their lives that are necessary for them to be whole people outside of work, that they're actually able to bring a better person to work. And so it's that we're unlocking as far as the human capital side of things is concerned. But then on the other side, what we're looking at is how can we help you improve your business. So, I mean, Henry Ford has attributed as saying, whether you think you can or whether you think you can't, you are right. Business leaders tend to fall into two categories, those who think they can and those who think they can't. We're talking to all those who think they can.
Thanks, Charlotte. Charlotte Lockhart there from, she's the CEO of 4 Day Week Global. Yeah, I'm convinced. Are you convinced, Evie?
I was convinced before Charlotte started speaking, and I've been watching or actually heard with her movement. It's fantastic. It makes all the sense in the world to me.
It's just a trial at the moment as well. I reckon give it a go. RNZ, maybe we could try it.
It's a trial until they do it, RNZ.
It is 35 minutes past 5. Kia mau tonu mai. You're listening to Checkpoint on RNZ National. Nona's here with our business news. Nona, 4-day week?
Well, what happens to the market on Friday or Monday or Tuesday or Wednesday or Thursday?
Okay.
I don't know.
Okay. No.
It doesn't seem like it could work 100% of the time.
Bring us up to date. What have you got?
Well, let's see. Let's talk about tourism for a second, because we have had that we've been talking about tourists getting bigger bang for their buck when they're here. So that's good, I suppose. But today is World Tourism Day. Did you know that? No, I bet you didn't. I didn't. There you go. And it's the first time in July, apparently, we had more than 100,000 overseas visitors. That's the first time since March 2020. So I suppose that's some good news. And we've also heard from Auckland Airport today on the occasion. What they're saying is that there's a lot more people coming here from North America. The numbers are way up and expected to even get stronger as we head into the summer season. So overall, tourism in New Zealand is looking pretty good, and the outlook is fairly positive with more and more airlines coming here.
We've covered the market somewhat today, but take us through the rest of it.
Well, it's an interesting one. I spoke with some other people, other than the people we heard earlier in the program. Yeah, one of the things that has kind of slipped away, I suppose, is the U.S. dollar itself. I mean, how high can it go? This question. So apparently, back in the day, long before I can remember, in 1985, there was a meeting in New York City where they signed an accord. These were the major the major economies of the world, signed an accord to devalue the U.S. dollar, which in those days was even stronger than it is now. So there is an end in sight somehow. Somehow, what the economists, strategists are saying is that enough will be enough at some point, and the U.S. dollar will level off or start to decline. When that happens, no one knows. But in the meantime, our New Zealand dollar, yes, it's trading lower against the U.S., but against its basket of trading partners. So that's the currencies of various trading partners. There's 17 of them in the basket. We're not that badly off. I mean, we're at 69 on the TWI, and the Reserve Bank is assuming it would get to like about 70, 71 is where it expects it to be. So overall, we're not that low, relatively speaking. Yeah, we've dropped down, but this is the New Zealand dollar, and how much lower it goes. I spoke with Jason Wong from the BNZ, and he seemed to think that we were, if this was a baseball game, we were at the bottom of the 7th inning. Okay. And so there's probably more upside risk than downside risk for the Kiwi, if that helps anybody.
Take us through the rest of your numbers, please.
Let me see if I can find the rest of my numbers now that I've gone through. Yeah, I do actually have them, but let's see where they ended up. Under here.
They're in a pile somewhere.
Yeah, here we are.
We're padding there.
Okay, so the index closed down nearly 2%, not surprising on a day like today. There was a 220-point drop to 11,200. 214, and the dollar's trading at 56.8 US cents, so a little bit of a recovery there. 87.6 Australian, 52.6 British pence.
Thanks, Nona Peltier there with our business news. Right, a leading Auckland mayoral candidate has been ordered to take down a how-to guide aimed at Chinese speakers. An account called Wayne Brown Elections used the social media platform WeChat to show voters how to cast their vote. The problem is the material used only showed Wayne Brown as the candidate, and it had a tick next to his name. Our reporter Lucy Sear has more.
Just 2 days after voting opened, an article appeared on WeChat giving a step-by-step guide to voting. It has several imitation photos of voting papers, which had Wayne Brown as the only named candidate and a tick next to his name. Auckland Electoral Officer Dale of Soske says it's a clear breach of the law.
I thought the example was inappropriate, and the legislation is quite clear that you cannot have anything that purports or is an imitation of a voting document, and I thought that was very close to the wind. So I have been in contact with the candidate and asked that be removed.
He says the purpose of the law is to ensure people only see the original voting document and are not influenced by anything that looks similar to it. The article was posted by an account named Wayne Brown Elections, which describes itself as responsible for promoting election information related to the candidate. Mr. Brown initially agreed to an interview, but later declined, saying he had a busy schedule. In a written statement, he said he wasn't aware of the post and only came across it when he was contacted by an official. He says it was the work of an enthusiastic supporter. While Mr. Brown says he regrets the accidental breach, he says there was no intention to mislead or confuse any voters. WeChat is used by many Chinese Kiwis to access news and information. Efeso Collins, who is also standing for mayor, says he's disappointed about the post.
Whether he knew or not, what's important is that we're honest with voters. And if you're saying to voters, this is my name and this is who I want you to vote for, then say so. But the potential of imitating a voting document, which has been deemed as illegal, is a clear breach of the rules.
He says the migrant community deserves straightforward information about elections.
Let's not play games with people where English is not their first language, and I think that's what is misleading and completely inappropriate about this.
Taiwan-born Howick Ward councillor Paul Young, who's standing again for his seat, says he's concerned some in the community may have been misled.
It's highly possible for those people not good in English, but they want to participate in voting. If they don't know or looks like you need to pick up two people, three people, they might be just follow that.
Mr. Young says many voters in ethnic communities rely on information on social media in their own language. Voting will close at midday on the 8th of October.
It's 5:42. You're with Checkpoint on RNZ National. Kia ora e te iwi, I'm Nick Trubridge and this is Checkpoint. Homai o whakaro. Don't forget you can text us on 2101 and you can tweet us at FirstUpRNZ, Facebook us, Checkpoint, or email checkpoint@rnz.co.nz. But now here's Evie with the headlines.
Kia ora, Nick. The police have arrested and charged an 18-year-old male and 5 youths over the robbery at a jewellery store in the St Luke's shopping mall in Auckland a week ago. The 6, along with 2 other youths, have also been charged with conspiring to commit aggravated robbery. The Green Party says recognised seasonal employer cap should not be increased until a review into the scheme has been done. 3,000 extra workers will be allowed into New Zealand in a bid to ease workforce pressures, and the government says it's already taken steps to crack down on migrant exploitation. Auckland's leading mayoral candidate says he regrets any accidental breach of electoral laws following a social media post urging people in the Chinese New Zealand community to vote for him. Wayne Brown says the post was made by a supporter and that he wasn't aware of it previously. A 4-week-old baby suffered a methadone overdose after a pharmacy failed to dispense their medication correctly back in 2018. The baby had to be treated successfully in ICU. A Gloriavale woman has told the Employment Court she doesn't believe the leadership knew about sexual abuse at the Christian community. A goat farmer in suburban Wellington says she's lost 60 baby goats this year alone, many newborn, after they were killed and eaten by wild pigs. And Nelson City Council has given the green light on a controversial plan change that allows part of the Maitai Valley to be subdivided for housing. Those are the headlines. Looking at traffic. In Gisborne, a section of Coastal State Highway 35 near Turihaua Beach, about 20 minutes north of the city, is closed, while the Armed Offenders Squad and police check reports of a person with a weapon. And State Highway 1 is closed north of Wellington at Levin for at least a couple of hours after a crash between a vehicle and a mobility scooter earlier today. Diversions are in place there. All other routes appear to be open at this stage around the country. Our next full bulletin and weather is at 6 o'clock.
Thanks, Evie. It's just come up 6:45. You're with Checkpoint on RNZ National. The feedback's in on 4-day weeks.
Glowing.
There's plenty of it.
It's glowing, isn't it?
Yeah. Let's start with the good stuff, because there's some not so good stuff as well. The company I worked for has been doing a 4-day work week here for 3 days now, and it's been a complete success. Best work environment I've had. Okay.
Wouldn't you have to do a bit more than 3 days to see if the 4-day week works?
4-day work week for 3 years.
3 years. You said 3 days.
Did I?
You said
4-day work week for 3 years.
I don't know.
My
It's been a
mistake.
long weekend. Maybe I got it wrong. Maybe I've got foggy brain. Maybe it's not a good idea.
Anyway, we have been doing a trial in our NZ construction software company for 10 months. It's tracking really well for wellness and productivity. Well, just on productivity, Richard is on the other side of the ledger. He says, Nick, economy in the doldrums, record inflation, high debt, high cost of living, of course, just the right time to cut working hours, la la land. Okay, Richard, but if productivity's still the same or higher, does it really matter?
And has the pandemic taught us nothing about mental well-being?
Anyway, do keep it coming. 2101, text us your feedback about 4-day weekends. 4-day weeks, rather. Right, imagine hopping on board a train from Christchurch to Dunedin. Dunedin City Council is keen on it. It's called for a business case to get passenger rail on track with services to and from Mosgiel, Christchurch and Invercargill. At today's meeting, 12 councillors said full steam ahead, with just one voting against it. Well, joining us now is Dunedin Mayor Aaron Hawkins. Kia ora, Mr Hawkins. How likely is this?
Kia ora, good afternoon. Well, we have easily the most attractive railway station in the country, and what we're asking for is a consideration given to kick-starting a regional, inter-regional passenger rail service in the South Island. So we've got more people coming on and off the platform there.
What's your time frame?
Well, that's a good question. And so the request today is let's find out how much it's going to cost and whether that's worth doing. We welcome the renewed enthusiasm of government for passenger rail, and really we're here to remind them that the rail line doesn't stop in the North Island.
How do you know there's going to be enough demand, though? Will you sort of go down the route of a trial like I believe Te Huia up here was before you kick on with it for good? Because if no one's using it, well, it's not much use, is it?
Well, that's the whole point of the exercise, right? I have very fond memories of travelling up and down the South Island on the Southerner as a youth, and we know that nostalgia is a hell of a drug. So let's find out what the public appetite would be, and whether it's feasible. We know that we need to find different ways of getting people around our towns and cities, and between our towns and cities in terms of decarbonising our transport network, and rail absolutely has to be a bigger part of that.
So you're out for feedback at the moment, right?
Well, we're responding to government. They were asking for feedback on inter-regional passenger rail, and our request to them in our submission is that they look at a business case for doing that in the South Island, which hasn't featured particularly prominently in the rail plan so far.
It was deemed unviable about a decade ago, right? So do you think things have changed?
It depends what you mean by viable. I don't think climate change is particularly economically viable, and certainly libraries and swimming pools and parks aren't particularly economically viable. We fund them as public goods. I think the problem is for too long, Kiwi Rail's been asked the wrong question. They've been tasked with making money on a rail service, and we've seen as a result of that a dwindling network of passenger rail increasingly aimed at high-end tourist products, when we know that people need and are increasingly after an option to be able to travel around the country that doesn't require them driving or flying. So I think, we need to ask a slightly different question when it comes to what kind of rail service do we need in the country.
Yeah, I agree. Climate change isn't viable, but I suppose the question is more around how do you think, with your mayor's hat on, you actually get people out of their cars and onto a carriage?
Well, that is the entire point of the exercise, right? And we know that.
Yes, but you must have you've been a thought leader on these sorts of things over your mayoralty. How do you think you would get them on board?
Well, we know that there's no shortage of demand, because any time we raise this conversation locally, we get overwhelmed with feedback from our community who want to have the option of being able to travel by rail up and down the South Island. And so the exercise here is testing that and seeing to what degree what that would cost and to what degree the government would be interested in providing that service on the South Island.
Could it just be used for big events like All Blacks games and things, or would you envisage weekly round-the-clock service?
Yeah, there are all sorts of ways of testing demand, and certainly big events are part of that. And I remember sitting at Carisbrook many years ago, and trains coming in from other cities and parking up on the bank there, and certainly that would be a great way of being able to bring people from other parts of the South Island to big events here. But I think it's a slightly different question to that of a regular scheduled service up and down the South Island.
Thanks, Aaron. Aaron Hawkins there, who is, of course, Mayor of Dunedin City Council. It is 5:51. Kia mau tonu mai. You're listening to Checkpoint on RNZ National. A Gloria Vale mother has told a court she does not believe the leadership knew about sexual abuse in the Christian community. Purity Vella has also denied being downtrodden and subjugated at an employment court hearing in Christchurch. Jean Edwards reports.
Purity Vella is a mother of 13 and has lived in the church her whole life. She says slanderous media coverage has made Gloria Vale members targets of public abuse.
The media uses our religious freedom and personal choices as a nationwide entertainment show to belittle and degrade the simple Christian life that we have the right to live by the laws of this free country.
The court heard the unwanted coverage followed charges for sexual offending at Gloria Vale, behaviour Mrs Vella agrees was unchristian. She says it came as a surprise to everyone.
It is not something that we agree with or condone, and I don't believe that the leadership knew all about that. I do believe that if they did, they would have made steps towards keeping us safe and talking to the police about the situation.
The court has heard evidence women and girls were always blamed for sexual misbehaviour at the commune. Mrs Vella says a sin is a sin.
There was a time and place where a woman needs to know what she should or shouldn't be doing. But I do not agree the onus was put on the woman.
She says Gloria Vale's leadership has advised girls how to present themselves to discourage or prevent unwanted attention.
The Bible speaks about a woman having downcast eyes, so I interpret that in modern times to mean not to be flirty and outgoing.
But Purity Vella told the court Gloria Vale's leadership doesn't have total control over every detail of members' lives.
I do not accept that Hopeful Christian or any other leadership invented the teachings and doctrines in the booklet What We Believe to enforce on us subjugation to their own advantage.
Purity Vella is married to a shepherd, and her daughter-in-law Pearl is one of the 6 former Gloriavale women seeking an employment court ruling they were employees during their time there. She denies being run off her feet, looking after her family and working.
As a woman here, I do not feel downtrodden and subjugated, but rather considered, respected, and my opinions are valued.
Mrs Vella says there have been big changes at Gloriavale, and it's unfair to blame the leadership for the way things have played out.
That was Jean Edwards reporting from Christchurch there. Right, a little bit more of your feedback now on the 4-day working week. This person says, the best roster I ever worked as a chef was a 4-day week. We would do 40 to 55 hours in 4 days, but we were rested physically and mentally after a 3-day weekend. Hi, Nick. 4 days for 5 days pay. What about those who work in a 24/7 service? It's a good question. I doubt Health NZ would pay nurses for 5 shifts per week and allow them to work just 4. Sorry, patients, no nurses today. No, that could work, though, if you had rosters done properly. Anyway. Mike in Auckland about the US dollar and the Kiwi dollar paling in comparison to it. My wife and I were planning a trip next year to the US and UK. Now we're thinking just UK, Mike says. Yeah, could be wise. But if you're not going till next year, maybe just wait and see. All right, the atmosphere in the Horowhenua town of Levin is highly charged as New Zealand's top electricity supply workers spark up for industry bragging rights. Line mechanics and cable joiners have been showing off their skills, and for the first time a team of women has taken part. Our Manawatu reporter Jimmy Ellingham got the shock of his life filing this report.
I am a lineman for the county no longer, as girl power makes its presence felt.
The main focus for our team really is inspiring maybe the mums and the daughters that are coming along to watch their dads, and then they see a bunch of women, doing the same things.
That's Liza Pickering, the manager of the Ultimate Women team at the annual Connection Line Mechanics competition in Levin, the first since the pandemic. The 3-day event shows what electricity supply workers do every day, from erecting power poles to first aid and pole top rescues. For Liza Pickering and her team, it's also about highlighting that women can do it too, in an industry dominated by men.
We're still in this mindset that, women, it's a bit hard work for girls to be digging holes and stuff like that, but at the end of the day, we're here to showcase that we are capable of doing these jobs, and a lot of it's just understanding that we have skills that are transferable.
And in their rotation, the Ultimate Women were the first team to put up their pole. As the sun shone, it was hot work, as Dion Adams from Taumaranui explains.
It was bloody beauty, reminded us of home. Yeah, hard thinking. I saw rocks, big hanging rocks in there.
So how do you get around that?
There's only one way, mate. Hard work.
People here know about hard work. Steve Lovejoy is managing Electra teams from Levin and the Kapiti coast. He was caught in the freak tornado that hit Levin in May.
Yes, I got hit by a tree in the tornado. Yeah, no, it was the actual ute got damaged, but I didn't realise what was happening at that time because it was just coming through. And then once I got out of that and got to work, basically I realised what had happened, and then that's when the work started, basically, yeah.
Every move the crews make is watched by an eagle-eyed team of judges headed by Rick Johnson. Today they've been assessing poles go up.
So the judges, they give them a specification sheet. The pole's got to be in the right depth in the ground. It's got to be square on. It's got to be plumbed. It's also more about how they actually use the cranes when they're lifting, how they set it all up, all the health and safety requirements.
Karen Gork-Roger is the director of Annexes, the infrastructure division of Te Pūkanga, the New Zealand Institute of Skills and Technology. It looks after apprentices for the electricity supply industry.
I suppose everyone remembers the ads on TV, the linesmen in the county sort of ads. But yeah, it is about diversity now. What women bring, it's not better, it's different. And, they bring in some really good attention to details, great communication, really good at following direction.
So, while Lions men still dominate, Lions women are joining them in increasing numbers to keep our power on.
Jimmy Ellingham there in Levin. Right, a little bit more of your feedback now. Let's go to the Christchurch to Dunedin train first. Hi there, RNZ. I totally agree with Aaron Hawkins in the need for more rail transport for everybody in Aotearoa. We are sick and tired of the Tauranga to Auckland Road dictating when and how we can leave Auckland. It can be a real pain. The traffic is now an impediment to family gatherings and intergenerational connections. Bring back passenger rail across the motu. Thank you, Vanessa. Ngā mihi to you as well. Shirley says, train between Christchurch and Dunedin, fabulous idea. Let's wait and see. Aaron Hawkins, of course, pretty keen on it. Right, back to 4-day weeks. 4-day weeks, I negotiated a 4 days by 9 hour contract. Working hard, they got as good as full-time per week. Yep, that would make sense. 9 across 4 days. By the time you have spent hours in the city commute, you might as well work the extra hours to make it worthwhile. Good outcome for everyone. A little bit on the New Zealand dollar. Is the US making the rest of the world pay for its exorbitant debt? Well, let's not get into that, I don't know. Doctors, we cannot get a doctor's appointment now. How are we going to cope with an extra 19,000 people, of course, coming in as RSC workers?
RNZ News at 6 o'clock. Good evening. Ngā mihi o te pō, ko Evie Ashton tēnei. An economist says New Zealand consumers face having to pay even more for goods and services that come in from overseas. The New Zealand dollar is on the slide, down 2% in the last week and 17% down for the year, after being caught in the crossfire of high inflation, rising interest rates and global economic woes. Cameron Bagri, the managing director of Bagri Economics, says currencies across the world are being hammered by the aggressive tightening of monetary policy in the US.
So the US dollar goes up, New Zealand dollar goes down, and it's not just the New Zealand dollar, it's the Australian dollar, the pound, the euro, Japanese yen, you name it. Everybody's suffering on the other side as we see a mad rush into US-denominated assets.
Cameron Bagri says the tourism and export sectors will benefit from the low-value dollar. The police have made multiple arrests over the robbery of a jewellery store at St Luke's shopping mall in Auckland a week ago. They say an 18-year-old male and 5 youths were arrested overnight and charged with aggravated robbery. The 6, along with 2 other youths, have also been charged with conspiring to commit aggravated robbery. The police say during vehicle searches as part of Operation Rhino, they found jewellery and other items. The 8 arrested will appear in the Auckland District Court and Youth Court. The government has warned the horticulture sector that with more RSE workers comes more responsibility. The recognised seasonal employer scheme is being expanded by more than 3,000 places to 19,000, the biggest jump in a decade. While it'll ease workforce pressures, employers will have to give workers sick leave. Immigration Minister Michael Wood is comfortable increasing the numbers while the scheme is being reviewed.
What we are doing at the same time as this is having employers and unions representing that workforce sitting down and working together to improve conditions. And one of the clear areas that has been identified for work is further work on accommodation.
The Green Party says any increase to RSE numbers should be stopped until the review has been brought forward. The White House is warning Russia that it will impose further economic sanctions if Moscow annexes more territory in Ukraine. President Joe Biden's spokesperson, Karine Jean-Pierre, says such sanctions will be swift and severe, and more details will be given in the coming days. Nelson City Council has greenlit a controversial plan change that allows part of the Maitai Valley to be subdivided for housing. A panel of independent commissioners recommended the council accept the proposed plan change after a week-long hearing in July. It could see around 350 houses developed in Kaka Valley. Nelson Mayor Rachel Reese told elected members it was inconceivable they could consider rejecting it.
To substitute yourself as a decision maker on the outcomes of a Resource Management Act decision, to consider yourself more knowledgeable than the highly qualified commissioners that were asked to undertake that role, who gave the commitment to running a fair process.
10 councillors voted to accept the plan change, while 3 voted against it. The Dunedin City Council has taken a step towards getting the return of passenger rail in the south. The Southerner Express service ran in the Lower South Island until 2002. The Dunedin City Council this morning approved a submission to central government calling for the return of passenger rail between Christchurch, Dunedin and Invercargill. The council also wants the viability of a service between Mosgiel and Dunedin assessed. Parliament's Transport and Infrastructure Select Committee is currently investigating the future of interregional passenger rail. A new report shows that only 5% of Māori assets are from treaty settlements. KPMG has released its Mauido report, which examines the role of post-settlement governance entities in a changing environment. National industry lead for Māori, Riria Te Kanawa, says it's often overlooked that the majority of the $69 billion Māori asset value is not due to treaty settlements. Only 5% of the value of Māori assets comes as a result of the treaty settlement process, a tiny fraction of the value lost to Māori. The report also found expectations of iwi entities far outweighs the resources they have available to work with. And one person has died following a crash between a mobility scooter and a vehicle in Levin. Police were called to the scene on State Highway 1 at the intersection of Queen Street East and Oxford Street this afternoon. The road is expected to remain closed for some time while police investigate. Meanwhile, State Highway 2 in the Waded Upper town of Carterton has reopened after a crash between McMaster and Main Streets. One person is in a serious condition. That's the news.
This week on Nights, linguist Dr. Julia de Bress talks about language helping her to adapt to a new country at the cost of her Dutch identity. Brian Easton talks about China's Belt and Road Initiative, while also considering the legacy of the Soviet Union's final leader, Mikhail Gorbachev. And then there's my final Sonic Tonic, a special retrospective 4,001 nights, give or take. So join me, Brian Crump, afternoon news at 7 for one more week on RNZ National.
This is RNZ National, Te Reo Irirangi o Aotearoa, on air on rnz.co.nz and on your mobile. You're back with Nick Trubridge next on Checkpoint. Now the short forecast from Met Service to midnight Wednesday for Northland, Auckland, Coromandel Peninsula, Bay of Plenty and Gisborne. Often cloudy. Isolated showers are clearing Gisborne tomorrow afternoon. From Waikato to Taranaki, including Taumaru Nui and Taupō. Partly cloudy, isolated showers developing about Taupō this evening and elsewhere tomorrow. Whanganui to Wellington, including Taihape, Hawke's Bay and Waded Upper, fine today. Partly cloudy tomorrow. Nelson and Marlborough, fine with high cloud. A few showers developing tonight, mainly about the ranges, then turning to rain tomorrow evening. Bulla, Westland and Fiordland, a few showers turning to rain tomorrow morning with heavy falls. For Canterbury, fine today. Scattered rain developing about the high country tomorrow morning with a few spots elsewhere, then clearing in the evening. Otago and Southland, partly cloudy with scattered showers, clearing tonight. Scattered rain developing about central Otago tomorrow with a few spots elsewhere. And for Rekohu, the Chatham Islands, cloudy periods, a few showers tomorrow. The time is 7 minutes past 6. Our next news headlines are at 6:30.
Thanks, Evie. No mai hoki mai. This is Checkpoint on RNZ National. I'm Nick Trubridge. The National Party and Labour remain reasonably steady in the latest One News Kantar public poll. Labour's increased 1% to 34%. National's popularity remains unchanged on 37%. As for the minor parties, the Greens and ACT are both on 9%. New Zealand First is on 3%, and Te Pāti Māori is on 2%. As for preferred Prime Minister, Jacinda Ardern remains in the lead. She's on 30%. Christopher Luxon remains behind her on 21%. Since the last poll in August, both National and Labour have grappled with individual MPs in the spotlight. National MP Sam Uffindale was accused of bullying, and Labour MP Gaurav Sharma made claims of bullying within his own party. Well, for more on all of this, we're joined now by political editor Jane Patterson. Jane, not much of a change really, is there? Sam Uffindale not having much of an effect on National.
Kia ora, Nick. The two parties settling in, the two major parties, National and Labour, into those mid-30s. And I think Labour would probably be quite happy that they have arrested the slide for now. National would have been wanting to make a bit more ground. As you've seen in those preferred Prime Minister stakes too, Jacinda Ardern and Christopher Luxon settling into those numbers as well. So all of this stuff really around the margin of error is very similar to the results back in August. I think too, in terms of the political controversies, it's been a very turbulent month or so. Perhaps the fact that Labour had its own problems, National had its own dramas, has perhaps cancelled each other out. Although I think sometimes these scandals don't necessarily damage parties so much in the polls. It's more like the impression that they leave and are more likely to be picked up. For example, if someone doesn't like National, then that might entrench it, and on the other side for Labour. So I think actually both parties would be relatively happy with this result.
Yeah, and if we were voting today, National and ACT could romp into power, couldn't they?
Romp, 61,
well,
they're
romp,
just
sorry.
there.
Get in.
It's still
Hyperbole
very
on
tight.
my part.
It's still very tight, 61, and then lining up to Party Māori, Greens and Labour on the other side, 51. So really it is still neck and neck. Obviously, there are, ACT would be a natural partner for National. To Party Māori would be a wild card in terms of who they may end up going with. They are probably the most independent, if I can put it like that, party, as in that they haven't said who that they would go with, as the Greens would with Labour. So that's still really tight as well. But look, we're a long way out. The Prime Minister has just said on One News that she will follow the tradition of announcing the election date at the start of election year. So we'll have a bit better idea at the start of the year when we will get to the general election. But Christopher Luxon saying that he would have, he is still getting to know, the electorate is still getting to know him. He obviously sees the potential to boost his profile and his popularity. Another interesting result out of this poll is those surveyed were asked between Ardern and Luxon, so take everybody else out, who would you choose for Prime Minister? And Jacinda Ardern has gained a little bit and Luxon has slipped a little bit. So again, Jacinda Ardern had really been battling her own personal rating. She's had a couple of trips overseas, whether that's added a bit of shine back onto her popularity. She'll be pretty happy with that. Another interesting element of this, undecided, 13%, and that is up slightly from 11% at the last poll.
And you mentioned Labour not sliding. In fact, there is a very slight bump there, right? And you also mentioned the fact that both parties would probably be relatively happy. But if I'm a political rookie and I'm looking at Labour's numbers still being back, why would I be happy if I'm Labour?
I suppose it's the trend. So when they were, they're not in a great place in terms of polling. They obviously want to be much higher, north of 40%. But when you look at the trend that was starting to come down, they were on that downward slide, and that's what they needed to stop. And at some point then, and their plan will be to rebuild that. But obviously they have a very hard road ahead of them. We've got the cost of living. We've got a number of challenges coming for the government. But you're going to start hearing the ministers and Jacinda Ardern today in question time really starting to talk up the successes of the Labour government. They're laying out everything that they've achieved despite COVID. National has been really attacking them hard on the cost of living and the economy. So Labour obviously thinking they need to get some good news out there. So the economy is going to be a huge one, and it's going to be a big push for Labour to convince voters that they can make this situation better. And on the other side, that Christopher Luxon is a credible opposition leader. He could be a credible Prime Minister. That will be where he is trying to position himself.
Thanks, Jane. Political editor Jane Patterson there joining us on that latest One News poll. If you're just joining us, not much has changed. National remains on 37%. And Labour up 1 to 34%. So relatively tight, 3 percentage points. All right, NASA has successfully tested the world's first planetary defence system by deliberately crashing a spacecraft into an asteroid, as you do. The DART mission is the first ever attempt to change the course of a large object, roughly the size of a football stadium. Jen Sullivan recaps the launch and explains what scientists are saying about this test.
Protecting Earth from potentially deadly objects in space. It sounds like the perfect plot for a Hollywood film, and it was in 1998.
It's what we call a global killer. Nothing would survive, not even bacteria.
Asteroids, especially large ones, are very real threats and something NASA is tracking.
At some point in the future, there's going to be something that's going to hit Earth. We don't want the Armageddon movie scenario.
10 months ago, NASA launched an uncrewed spacecraft. And Monday night, they purposely crashed it into an asteroid. The mission was called the Double Asteroid Redirection Test, or DART. The purpose? Hit the asteroid head-on to alter its path and change its speed.
We're taking a giant step in planetary defense.
The DART spacecraft was the size of a refrigerator. The asteroid? As big as the Great Pyramid of Giza in Egypt. The spacecraft was going nearly 15,000 miles an hour when the two collided.
If we can confirm that the thing was deflected by less than 1 degree, we know that this would, in principle, work on a large scale.
This asteroid was about 7 million miles away from Earth. But scientists say this test helps them prepare for future threats that could be much closer.
It happens, every few 100,000 or a few million years or so, Earth gets hit by an asteroid. And when it does, it's usually bad for those who are around.
The last time a deadly asteroid hit Earth? Around 66 million years ago.
That wiped out the dinosaurs.
Monday's test hopes to prevent that from ever happening again.
To the US now, where Floridans are bracing themselves for a direct hit from Hurricane Ian. Officials are warning the Category 2 storm could be something that we haven't seen in our lifetime. CNN's Ryan Young has more.
This could be the storm that we've hoped would never come to our shores.
Up and down the west coast of Florida tonight, hurricane preparations underway. It's been a century since the Tampa area of South Florida has been directly hit by a hurricane, and now Hurricane Ian could change history.
Everyone, and I mean everyone in Pinellas County, will witness some degree of impact from the storm.
Nearly 170,000 people have already been ordered to evacuate in the Tampa area alone, and schools and universities announcing closures in preparation for the storm and set up as emergency shelters.
We are looking at the possibility of having 10 to 15 foot storm surge, and clearly that would be very devastating for our community.
That's 5. Residents here taking this seriously.
Yeah, I wasn't really worried about it yesterday, but today, you start making your preparations and doing what you got to do, right? Tie everything down, secure your cars, make sure you got enough food and water at the house, and that's all you can do.
I think we're taking it pretty seriously. Up until yesterday, we were thinking it was going to hit, Panama City or something like that. But right now, I think it's real.
The Tampa area of Florida more vulnerable than other parts of Florida.
The area around Tampa Bay, there are just a lot of low-lying areas, compounded with a lot of development. So we have a very large population that's built up since the last hurricane, and it's built up in low-lying areas. And so we have a lot of exposure, a lot of risk.
The Florida National Guard has activated 5,000 Florida Guardsmen, as well as 2,000 additional Guardsmen from Tennessee, Georgia, and North Carolina.
Every official here with dire warnings to prepare for the very worst.
This is going to be a storm like we have not seen in the past.
It's 17 minutes past 6. You're with Checkpoint on RNZ National. Japan is preparing to hold a state funeral for its former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, who was shot dead during an election rally in July earlier this year. To his admirers, Mr. Abe was a statesman who recognised the threat from China long before others did. But more recently, some have expressed opposition to the state funeral because of his foreign policies. The BBC's Rupert Wingfield-Hayes reports from Tokyo.
There is an enormous typhoon currently sweeping across Japan, bringing torrential rain, but that has not stopped between 10 and 15,000 people turning out here in Tokyo today to show their adamant opposition to Shinzo Abe having a state funeral. Since his death back in July, it has been extraordinary to see the growth in opposition. to him having a state funeral. Nearly 60% of Japanese now think it shouldn't happen.
There are banners here accusing Abe of corruption and cronyism. There are others that say the cost of his state funeral is too high. But there is one slogan I see here over and over and over. No to war. Abe made Japan able to go to war and fight again, this woman tells me. That is why I'm against him having a state funeral. These people believe deeply in Japan's pacifist constitution, and they believe Shinzo Abe trashed it. In 2014, Mr. Abe forced through legislation that bypassed Japan's constitution and allowed Japanese troops to fight beyond its borders for the first time since World War II. After Mr. Abe's killing at an election rally in July, there was an outpouring of shock and outrage that such a crime could happen in Japan. But then his state funeral was announced and the mood shifted. Even some of Mr. Abe's strongest critics, like Professor Koichi Nakano of Tokyo's Sophia University, have been taken by surprise.
I'm actually surprised that the opposition to the state funeral has gone up so much more. I think it has most to do with the fact that Abe is seen as somebody who is not accountable to his people, and so whatever he did against the principles of democracy.
The scale of these protests shows just what a divisive figure Shinzo Abe remains, even after his death. About half the country think his legacy is problematic. On the other side, around a third think he was a visionary who saw the balance of power in Asia shifting and did what was needed to get Japan ready. Professor Kazuto Suzuki is a former Abe advisor and is very much in the second camp.
He was ahead of his time. He understood this changing balance of power. The rising China will distort the balance of power in the region.
But Japan is still a country deeply scarred by war. Memories of the atom bombing still pervade the society. Mr. Abe's vision was that Japan should be a country able to defend itself and able to fight alongside its allies if necessary. But he never asked the Japanese people, and it's clear many continue to reject that vision of their future.
Brothers of Italy leader Giorgia Meloni has claimed victory in a general election that sees her set to be Italy's first female Prime Minister, leading the most far-right government since the fascist era of Benito Mussolini. Barbie Nadeau reports from Rome.
The leader of Italy's centre-right coalition, Giorgia Meloni, will now likely become the first female Prime Minister of Italy. Despite low voter turnout, she was able to secure the majority, together with far-right Lega leader Matteo Salvini and centre-right politician Silvio Berlusconi. As Italians woke up on Monday morning, they grappled with a new reality. It was clear that the result wasn't to everyone's taste.
I'm not really happy with the action they want to take. I think that the main problem of my generation and the next generation, the environmental problem, is not really a priority for them. We have a lot of problems now, economical and social, with the energy crisis. So let's see what they want to do. And I'm not really that confident, but...
Italy, like the rest of Europe, is in the midst of an energy crisis. Everyone is feeling the pinch. This coffee bar in central Rome has been in Lorenzo Vanni's family since 1929.
The biggest problem we have is the cost of the energy, because we had an increase of 5 times more than before. From 15,000, now we had a bill of 54,000.
Vanni wants a government that puts its people first.
We have to see if they will find an agreement among the three, Berlusconi, Salvini and Meloni, to make things for Italy.
Giorgia Meloni has become a symbol of hope for that change. This woman tells me that even though Meloni has a very strong character that could intimidate some, she likes her and she hopes that there will be change. We met Antonio Mosca. He told us it was others' weaknesses that led to Meloni's victory. Brothers of Italy were able to understand voters' discontent, he says. But he also tells me, in Italy we change our mind very often. We are a very divided country and very different from north to south. Today Meloni has 24%, but that could be 10% in a couple of months. Meloni's coalition won a clear mandate not seen in Italy for decades. She campaigned on traditional family values, against irregular immigration, and on giving dignity back to Italians. There are a lot of expectations on Giorgia Meloni. This country's had 67 governments and 30 prime ministers in the last 75 years. In 2018, Italians voted for the anti-establishment five-star movement, but that was before the pandemic and before the war in Ukraine. This time, they voted for a very precise political direction. Now it's up to Giorgia Meloni to unite the country and make good on her campaign promises.
There is growing international condemnation of Iran 10 days after the death of a young woman in police custody after being arrested for breaking headscarf rules. There have been widespread protests, and one human rights group says at least 76 people have been killed. Despite a security crackdown, demonstrations and acts of solidarity are spreading, CNN's Jomana Karadesh reports.
Regime supporters out en masse. These organized pro-government rallies a show of unity against the so-called rioters, they say. Iran's leadership is dismissing the thousands of protesters across the country as a handful of mercenaries. They claim it's all a foreign plot to destabilize the Islamic Republic that is only just beginning to unleash its brutal force to crush the rising voices of dissent. It's throttling the internet, blocking social media sites, dragging protesters off the streets, and using lethal force to silence those rising up for their rights. No one really knows how many lives have been lost. But the gut-wrenching scenes of those grieving their loved ones are slowly trickling out. The heartache, the agony of families burying their dead need no words to explain. Javad Haidari was 36, shot at a protest last week. His family says he bled to death. Amir Fouladi was only 15, one of several children killed according to Amnesty International. Her name is Hadith Najafi, one of countless women who've said enough to tyranny and repression. Hadith never made it back from a protest. Her family says she was shot 6 times. Her Instagram posts tell a story of a young woman who loved her country, loved life, music, dressing up and dancing. Her devastated sister mourning her in this Instagram post. She writes, "Sis, how did they have the heart to shoot you? My tears have dried up. I can't breathe. Forgive me, I wasn't there to defend you." Hadith was 23. The threat of bullets, of prison, of flogging hasn't stopped the protests. Nightfall brought hundreds back on the streets. Their daring chants of death to the dictator echoing through the dark streets of Iran. A defiant generation risking it all for freedoms they've never known.
The British aristocrat who organised Queen Elizabeth's funeral has been banned from driving for 6 months, despite claiming he needs his licence to arrange the King's coronation. The Earl Marshal, the 18th Duke of Norfolk, pleaded guilty at court in London to using his mobile phone behind the wheel. The BBC's Helena Wilkinson reports.
The prosecutor said that Edward Fitzalan Howard was stopped by police in April after driving his BMW through a red light. The 65-year-old already had 9 penalty points on his licence, meaning a further 6 points would lead to a ban. But he argued that he would suffer exceptional hardship if he was disqualified, highlighting his official duties. Having overseen the funeral of Queen Elizabeth, he is also now in charge of arranging the King's coronation. The Duke gave part of his evidence behind closed doors for what were described as reasons of national security. His lawyer had argued that details of the coronation, which had not yet been discussed with the King, Prime Minister or Archbishop of Canterbury, should remain private until after the event. Despite his arguments, a ban was imposed. Chair Judith Way accepted this was a unique case, but that the defendant's hardship was not exceptional.
That's almost it from us. A little bit of feedback before we go on 4-day work weeks. A 4-day work week is all very well, but the problem is many people don't even have a 5-day work week these days. Casual contracts and inadequate employment laws mean that the 40-hour work week is a thing of the past for many people. What is needed is a massive review of employment law, as radical as something from, the Savage government that restores dignity and democracy to the workplace. Another train advocate, of course, the potential train service from Christchurch to Dunedin. This person says rail is easy. Copy Germany with $9 tickets. Trains will be full, they say. Another piece of feedback on the US dollar. It is ridiculous for the RBNZ governor to talk of soon being in a happy place when the dollar fall is adding to inflation. First up, back in the morning, they'll be at the Costco opening. What will it do for New Zealand's supermarket duopoly? I guess time will tell. Don't miss it.
RNZ News headlines at 6:30. Good evening. Kia ora tātou. Ko Evie Ashton tēnei. National and ACT have the numbers to form the next government, sitting on 37% and 9% respectively, according to the latest One News Kantar poll. Support for Labour is at 34%, while the Green Party sits on 9%. An economist says consumers face having to pay even more for goods and services that come in from overseas, with the New Zealand dollar on the slide. And one person has died following a crash between a mobility scooter and a vehicle in Levin this afternoon.